Today is Wednesday, May 25th, and we are here on Psychedelics Today with Lex Pelger. Lex, thanks for joining us today. We invited you on to chat about some of your work and your research. And you were just recently up in Vermont for our psychedelic dinner and storytelling event, so we figured we'd invite you on and do a little wrap up with that, with symposium and storytelling event, and maybe recap some things, and then talk about some other topics of interest. So
Sure,
thanks
great.
for
Thanks.
thanks for having us on, or thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So it was really great for you to come up to Vermont and host a storytelling event. How'd you get into all this?
It actually came about really naturally, and it really has more to do with my partners at Symposia. Brett and Brian have been really big pushers of the events that Symposia did. And so we started with a conference at UMass Amherst and then had another one the following year, and they went really well. And we realized how much we enjoyed getting people from the psychedelic community out to hear from their elders and from experts around. And so we started off with those big conferences, and then things started to get smaller and smaller. And we had our People on Drug lecture nights, and they would be really fun. Go to Philadelphia and have Dennis McKenna speak, and then have a storytelling event afterwards, along with some other people. But more and more, for me, the heart of it, as the events have gotten smaller, they've gotten even better. And now that we're down to my very favorite thing, which is just straight storytelling nights. And it never ceases to amaze me how powerful these can be. Because I used to have it where I'd have a couple of people who were talent who would show up, and they would do the longer, bigger stories, and that would be the backbone of it. Then have an open mic. But the more and more, if you just put an open mic on stage and tell people to tell you the drug stories that are most important to them, it's incredible what comes out. And it's not nearly at all beautiful niceness, the ineffability of oneness of us all. There's a lot of darkness that comes up, and there's a lot of healing, and there's a lot of just strange incidences you would never ever guess would happen. And it's amazing. I think our best one was after UNGAS, which was the UN big drug policy summit just last month. And we found a place kind of last minute down the East Village, and everybody came out who was in town for the event, and I had nobody lined up. And I went up to the corner of the room and I said, if you want to hear stories, come up and pitch me, because that's the only stuff we're going to hear. And it was incredible, the talent and the beauty of the stories that got shared that day. And what's always striking to me as someone who writes about drugs and have been collecting people's drug stories for about 10 years now, is that every one of these storytelling sessions, constantly, I'm being surprised by a new way of doing drugs that I had never heard before. And almost all of them make complete sense. The second someone tells you that this happens, like, oh, of course that could happen to somebody out in the world in this good way or bad way. But I just never would have put it together before that it did. And so it's actually turns out to be an incredible way to learn from your peers and your elders. And so we're doing more, getting into drug education and lectures and festival outreach and things like that. But more and more, my heart is becoming these storytelling sessions that really serve as a glue for the community and a place for us to learn from each other.
Yeah, I was down there at Amherst for your first storytelling event and watching it grow from there. And then you come into Vermont and, we just had this storytelling event in this small little yoga studio. And honestly, it almost built a community. Like after we had the psychedelics dinner for the MAPS fundraising, and then coming down to this little intimate space to share stories. I mean, we got so much feedback about how our community was hoping more events like this would spur up, just because of the connection. There's so many people around here that have these experiences and want to share it, but really don't have a venue or a space to share it in. And so that was something really cool that came out of like hosting this event. And I'm grateful for you coming up and emceeing it and hosting and, starting the conversation, because now more people are really interested in keeping things moving up here.
That's great. Yeah, that's what we love to hear. Thank you. And I mean, it's easy. It's great for me because I'm a drug writer. So my job is collecting drug stories. And so it just collects all of that wisdom into one place. And it's beautiful. It's a great way to get paid in my favorite currency. And And that's what I would encourage anybody out there who might be interested in some kind of great community building event, whether you be an SSDP chapter, Students for Central Drug Policy, looking for something fun to do for your people, or you're in a, one of those great little hippie towns spread across the United States, you can just declare a storytelling session and just put up an open mic, and it'll be a beautiful night. And if you want it to be about drugs, Symposia is happy to help. If we're close enough that we can send somebody to help host it or to help pull it together, we are happy to. And if we're not, hell, we'll just throw the Symposia brand name on the thing and let you have a storytelling session. We get a couple of people on our email list that show up as well. And that's becoming the most important thing to me, is just creating community. Because one thing that's very, very clear from the fight for medical marijuana and from the gay fight before it was that it's knowing people in the movement that changes hearts and minds, especially medical marijuana. The most important indicator of whether you support liberalization of medical marijuana laws isn't your place on the political spectrum. It isn't even whether you smoke pot or not. It's whether you know a patient who's using cannabis for healing. That's what really has changed the hearts and minds in this country. And so that idea of coming out of the closet has been gathering steam with people like our friend Nishay, pushing it. And it's really important for people to be able to share. Here are how these drugs changed my life, often for the good, sometimes for the bad. And here's the lessons I learned about how and why and when to do them. And that's what we hope to foster. And we're always looking for new partners to reach out and work with. So feel free to shoot me an email. I'm easy to find.
And how do we get in touch with you?
My name's Lex Pelger, and so there's none other of us in the world. There's only a handful of Pelgers anywhere. Cool. But so it's pelger@gmail.com. But also you can go to the Symposia site and see videos of old storytelling and lectures and things like that, and other things that we're getting up to.
Awesome. Yeah, and I, hope people reach out to you guys, because it's really an amazing opportunity to get your community together and share these stories. Yeah, so thanks for what you're doing. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, no problem. It really is. It's fascinating and enjoyable. And I honestly think I just realized recently what it might be for our people is church. Because church usually has not much to do with religion or spirituality. Church is a place you get to go see babies and old people and talk to people. And these storytellings, that's exactly what you get. I get to talk to people who've been doing this work for 30 or 40 years. And, so much with as unspecific as these drugs are in their way, especially the psychedelics, it's so helpful to have someone who has 30 years of experience, because things generally might tend to go in one way, but there's always exceptions to that rule. And there's always that one time in 1,000 crazy event that you wouldn't expect to happen. And it really takes someone with decades of experience with marijuana or psychedelics or MDMA to really understand how many nuanced approaches you might need to really incorporate these medicines. And that's where I think the learning comes better from storytelling than it does from gold standard, double-blind, peer-reviewed research in the literature, which is incredibly important in one way, but it's only part of the battle for data,
right?
If you will.
Yeah, I always wonder that too. The scientific research of double-blind studies versus like subjective experience. Like, I don't know. Me personally, I think studying subjective experience is important in the field of this research. I mean, because that's kind of all we have, in some sense, of people's experiences to understand it.
It's true, and it's one of the sad parts of science of this last half century or so, is that once we started to come up with this idea of clinical trials, it really took root because it was such a powerful idea, but it also starved out the old way of doctoring, going back to Doctors Parkinson's or the guys who founded Johns Hopkins, which is listening to patients and getting really thorough reviews and talking to your fellow doctors and getting their ideas about what works. And so I think science is moving back in that direction as it's opening up and starting to get better about sharing again, and realizing that sharing is what sparks innovation. It's not your own isolated towers of data. And so it's incredibly important that an organization like MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, that when they started working with MDMA for PTSD, they were very thorough in creating good clinical data that would be respected by clinicians. And that's why they started with mostly women who had treatment-resistant PTSD from sexual assault, which meant that for maybe the last 10 or 20 years, these patients had tried every therapy under the sun, all the drugs you've heard of, and acupuncture, diet, all the weird alternatives that you might have heard of, they had tried just to get some semblance to their life. And so when they did this MDMA trial, the data on the scales used to measure PTSD was so striking that any clinician worth their salt would look at this and realize that there's something here worth paying attention to. And so that kind of data is so helpful. And it's so important to get basic safety data for the body, basic response rates, and getting general ideas of the powers and the weaknesses of this modality you're looking at. But that's really the getting started kind of stuff. If you really want to dig into this, then it's reading books like The Secret Chief about Leo Zeff. And this was the doctor who actually went around the country teaching people about LSD psychotherapy when it was legal. And then when it became illegal, he went into retirement because it was about that time. And it made him sad to lose this incredible therapeutic tool that he had discovered. But then when his friend, Alexander Shulgin, resynthesized MDMA, now known as ecstasy, and gave it to his small group of research people, then Leo Zeff was so amazed by the power of this drug and really said it was what he had been waiting for his whole career, that he started calling the drug Atom and then traveling around the country again and introduced thousands of therapists of the general guidelines for using this drug safely. And he did this while it was still legal. And so he could afford to have these big open sessions. People didn't have a prejudice against this drug, MDMA, because of all the media horror stories. And he got to spread the good news that here's a drug that is incredible for end-of-life anxiety, for stopping PTSD, for really, it seems like probably a whole host of other mental health conditions we haven't got a chance to even study yet. But that's really the way to learn how to use this medicine, is diving into the works that MAPS and others have been doing and figuring out the literature, and then talking to the people actually doing it. And that's where you're going to get so much of your learning as a clinician about what might be helpful for your patients and what you should be paying attention to.
That's really great advice, especially, for students or anybody that are thinking about entering into this field. And I know, from the statistics, reading the studies of their first clinical trials to even enter into it, you had to have 20 years of diagnosed PTSD. You had to go through conventional therapies and be on pills and stuff like that. And I mean, and just to say that you have 20 years of PTSD and then over 85% of those 19 participants that went through the first clinical trials. I mean, that's mind blowing. I talked to some of the people I work with, and they're like, "What, really? Like, that's a thing?" I'm like, "Yeah, And, you still get odd looks, like, but you're talking about ecstasy, and then I'm like, But yeah, I mean, the statistics are amazing, and I think that's really important to get those guidelines and that structure down.
That's quite the number. 20 years of treatment-resistant PTSD. Is it something along those lines for the first trials?
Mm-hmm.
I think, I believe so.
Yeah,
that's what
I don't know. I don't know the numbers very well off the top of my head, and it's not my, it's not my field as well.
Right.
But the numbers can be described by anyone actually in this field who knows this stuff as striking, incredible, almost unbelievable, which is almost a problem with so many of these drugs. I mean, you look at to move to the other molecule that's being well studied, psilocybin, from the magic mushroom plant. You look at the work out of Johns Hopkins, and the craziest number to come out of that is over half the people said that their one-time dose of psilocybin was one of the most important experiences in their life. And the grand majority said it was in the top 5 of things they'd ever experienced, up to and including the birth of a child. And if you've taken the medicine, if you're experienced, as they used to say, that makes sense. You can believe that. But to the vast majority of Americans who haven't, it is it's so profound that it strikes them as not really possible, that this could be true for people facing cancer and end of life anxiety. And it turns out that this one trip on this one mushroom that grows in cow shit is the thing that really that changes things, that actually leads to personality changes and more openness, which in psychology for a number of decades has been an idea that's been pretty immutable, is that personalities don't change. You got what you got, and that personality, maybe you can shift it a little bit, but it's a little bit like a giant cruise ship. The rudder is only going to give you a little bit of play. And the idea that psilocybin can actually enact personality change is really threatening to the paradigms of a lot of doctors who grew up in this stuff. Mm-hmm. And so there has to be some compassion there too about it's not easy to be someone doing something for a number of decades, and then all of a sudden a revolution hits that says everything you've been saying, we found an easier path, and that thing you believe to be true isn't nearly as true as you thought it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like another interesting thing about some of that research is that the long-term effects, like with MDMA, they're looking 3 to 4 years of personality change afterwards of their initial doses. Like we had somebody when I was teaching the history of psychedelics class with Lenny, we had an Iraq war vet come up, and they were talking about how after their first dose, their CAP score went from 87 to 12, and it was like down to 12, after like 3 years. And then even with the John Hopkins studies, I believe they were doing some like, a year out or so, and they were noticing people had these personality shifts, and it lasted for about a year after their initial dose. So I mean, like, I think that's really interesting to see that these medicines, it's not just like, okay, you have to keep taking it, whatnot. Like, it's like a couple doses, and you get these changes that last for a pretty significant amount of time.
Can you define CAP score?
What was that?
Can you define the CAP score?
I forget what it stands for. I don't. But it's the way that they diagnose PTSD. I forget. It's like I could maybe look it up real quick.
It does speak to, I think, a really important idea that I heard first expressed by Gary Snyder, the beat poet, and his thought was it's going to take 3 generations to incorporate these medicines into modern Western society because they're so explosive and there's such a differential engine in their way. And that the first generation is going to be exactly what we saw. It's going to be the overindulgence, the teenage years, dad taking away the car keys after going too far. And that's the story of the 60s. It was too much. Leary's very democratic approach overwhelmed the Brahmin approach that Huxley was advocating. And so it stopped for such a long time. And then we entered the second generation of very cautious clinical work being done at these universities. And it's incredibly important that this very basic research questions get answered, because it's fairly incredible that no one has yet, up until last year, nobody officially had taken LSD in a brain scanner to see what the heck would happen. I mean, that's just unconscionable lack of research on something that's obviously important. But now we're coming to the end of that psychedelic renaissance second generation, because the data's there and it confirms what all of the hippies learned experientially in the first generation. And so what he sees and hopes, and what I hope, is that we're coming into the third generation that really integrates this hard science Western data approach with what we know, and integrate the knowledge that we can learn from the indigenous communities around the world who have been doing this for such a long time, and the more mystical Americans that would also we could be learning from. Thinkers like William James are much more applicable to today's to these medicines than some of the more modern reductionistic approaches. And so I do hope that's what is starting to emerge now, is finally the grand synthesis between the masculine and the feminine into something that is wholesome and holistic and well integrated into the society. But it won't be easy. There's no right answer, and there won't be a right answer. It will be as many individual answers as there are people on the planet. And so you have to really be able to write laws that are flexible enough to accommodate that, and to be open-minded enough to allow culture to flourish and the many different ways that psychedelics have grown into their own specialized niches. The drug world is not this big overarching movement of people. It's now many different movements with many different streams, and some of them going in opposite directions, which is fine. It's part of what's important about this, but it's going to make it more challenging to be open-minded and accepting of what works for whoever. And that's what it really has to come down to. Is this working to help a person? Well, then we have to enable it to the best of our ability.
I heard an interview just the other day with Sam Harris. I'm sure you guys are familiar with him. Yeah, so he's an interesting guy. What's his background? Neuroscience, but he's now coined himself a philosopher. So, with good reason. Very atheistic, but his whole thing is our program of culture really should be to alleviate suffering and to heal people. Don't get too trapped in like conspiracy thinking, but like, if you want to do the most good, like really just try to help people. And it's that kind of a thing. Like, we might not totally understand the mechanism of action of these drugs, but do we really need to? We know they're safe and we know they help people. So like, why the 40-year hiatus, 60-year hiatus or something? I don't know. It's been a long time. So, Lex, you were talking to us earlier about strong interest in ketamine research, like depression and addiction therapies. Can you maybe get into like what about ketamine interests you?
Ketamine interests me so much. It interests me enough, in fact, that I think it might be the second book, if I ever get there, that I'd like to write, is about ketamine as a double-edged sword of our generation. Because on the positive side with ketamine, it's strikingly remarkable what this drug can do. If you look at the work of Krupitsky out of Vladivostok in Russia, he worked with about 1,000 alcoholics and heroin addicts and stopped their addiction with ketamine. And you can see that somewhat in the underground of the United States, too, though Ibogaine's more preferred here, which is almost a plant version of ketamine in its way that does many other things as well. But ketamine is really incredible for interrupting the physical addiction with alcohol and opiates, and that can be what makes it so powerful. In addition, what makes it even more appealing to the masses is what it does for depression, because, and of course, there's no panacea for depression by any means, and any researcher who's been creating data about depression, whether intramuscular or IV, knows that for their very treatment-resistant patients, sometimes this is helpful, sometimes it's only helpful for a while, sometimes you really have to get nuanced about how much and when you're going to be giving ketamine to them. But for so many more regular people, what ketamine can do is just alleviate anxiety and depression for a couple weeks. I know a number of women, older women in this city of New York, where they stopped taking their anti-anxiety, antidepressant medications, and now instead, every 3 weeks or so, Sunday evening, they'll lay out their 3 moderate bumps of ketamine, put on some really good music and lock the door, and then just take the evening to themselves and just take that short dive every 10, 20 minutes, take a little bit more, and slowly get down to that dissociative space, but not the K-hole, not that completely removing yourself from reality type weirdness. It seems like the most effective dose of ketamine for self-reflection, for meditation, for alleviating depression is a sub K-hole dose. I always call it going around the drain, in fact, where it just kind of slowly, the more ketamine you take, the more of your brain just slowly shuts down. What ketamine is actually doing is it's blocking the glutamate in your brain, which isn't a sexy neurotransmitter like serotonin or dopamine, but it's actually one of the most important, because glutamate is your brain's basic excitatory neurotransmitter, which means it's a green light. For every neuron in the brain, when it wants to say yes, glutamate's usually the way it says yes. And so if you block that, a little bit of blocking of ketamine, and you get loose and in your body, and it works really well with MDMA, and people really enjoy that for dancing, and why it's such a popular club drug now. But then you take a moderate dose, and I think that's the more healing dose, but it's also great for sitting back and watching Fantasia with your friends, or for a lovemaking dose, or for just sitting and being with yourself kind of experience. And so for that, it can be really wonderful. And then if you take a bunch of ketamine, obviously that's the K-hole where you're completely removed from reality. And that's not a bad thing. Just most people wouldn't find it enjoyable. And it's certainly not enjoyable if you're in the middle of a club and you take way too much, either because you think it's cocaine, which happens all the time, and you get knocked out by that, or because the ketamine's, not as strong as you thought. And now there are actually ketamine analogs that are starting to hit the market. So it's easier, just like MDMA is often not what you think it is. That's soon going to be more and more true for your ketamine as they get analogs that are cheaper to produce. But that's the good side is what it can do for depression and addiction. But the dark side of ketamine is that while it's not really physically addictive, and you can't overdose on it at all because it's so safe. It's actually the anesthetic they give to infants and the elderly for surgery because it doesn't depress the lungs at all, unlike the other anesthesias that they use. The only reason it's the World Health Organization lists it as a required drug for a functioning medical system because it's the safest thing to give when you to knock someone out for a surgery. But the flip side is that that's a terrible thing to happen to you in the middle of a club or something. It's going to freak people out, and you can definitely get in trouble when you're completely passed out. I mean, luckily you cannot overdose by any means, but you can be knocked out for half an hour. And when you come out of it, obviously you're loopy as hell. That's why they don't use it for adult surgery generally, is because anesthesiologists don't like the messiness of what they call emergent effects coming out of surgery, which really is a scientific term for coming out of a damn K-hole after surgery. Which is very, very disorienting. And that's why I think the best you can do, I know a nurse who goes to Burning Man and who works at a children's hospital. And so she's exactly who those kids need, because before surgery, she says to them, this is the kind of experience you're going to have. And here's what it's going to be like when you're coming out of it. It might be a little strange. Here's the games we're going to play to get you ready for that. And that's what really a good clinician should be at. She knows the science. She's read the reports, but she knows a lot more than most of the anesthesiologists do because she's taken the drug and she pays attention to people better than, most doctors.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So that's the safety profile is great physically, but mentally, it's such an addictive drug. And it's really worrisome to see what it did, especially in the electronic dance music scene, because what it does for depression at small doses is what causes the harm at high doses, because it's very easy to separate yourself out from reality and not have to deal with life anymore. And because you can build up tolerance to it so fast, it's very easy for anybody to say, well, I'm just going to take a little bump because I'm just about to go out for a walk, or I'm going to take a little bump because I'm about to watch something, or eat dinner, or write, or go to sleep, or wake up. And all of a sudden, you're doing little bumps of ketamine all the time. Eventually, for one thing, that's terrible for your bladder. And there are lots of kids in England who are now getting their bladders replaced in their 20s.
Yeah, that was one thing I was going to bring up. I definitely have come across the research of it damages the bladder. So that is probably one downside of prolonged addictive use is, bladder damage.
It's the clear physical downside, but it takes a lot. I mean, that's usually people who are shooting IMing or IVing multiple times a day for a year. And it seems like it's that length of time to get a true addiction too. And that's what William Burroughs always said about addiction. It takes a couple of months to get a really serious habit. Once you have it, it's easy to fall back into it. But it can be the same thing with ketamine. You see it out at parties and clubs where a group of friends gets into the drug and they're doing it too much at parties and they're looking sloppy, and it just makes her not a pretty experience. But then they stop going to the parties so much. Then they start staying home all the time and just doing ketamine all the time and staying in the hole for days at a time. And there's always that one friend who is even freaking out the people who are way too far into ketamine as well. And you just start to lose touch with reality. I call it the John Lilly effect because, he was actually had a number of mental aberrations as a young man. So it's not all drugs with him. But by the end of his life, John Lilly thought there was an alien spaceship orbiting the Earth that was beaming messages directly into him as the Messiah and savior of the planet. And that's the kind of grandiose thinking that ketamine can often enable. And I think the common wisdom on this kind of stuff is it's okay to think that you're a Messiah. The problem is if you think you're the only one.
Right.
And that's... to watch ketamine suck people down mentally into its addiction can take quite a while. But once it happens, it's a frightening thing. It's a sad thing. And there isn't much support or knowledge about what might happen there. And so between those two swords, that's why I think this is just such a fascinating drug for the good and for the bad.
I was smoking a cigarette with somebody one time, and we were just sharing it back and forth. And I think this is like really good advice just about drugs in general. And I said, oh, hey, you want like a last like toke off of it? And they just kindly looked at me and shook their hand, said, no, thanks. That's my dose. And I really thought about it. It's like, that's my dose. Who says that about like a cigarette? Like somebody knows their dose of nicotine. And like, it just really made me think about drugs in general. It's like, A, why are you taking it? What's your dose? Are you trying to have a small therapeutic dose? Are you trying to overdo it? Are you trying to escape? Do you want this big experience? And like, I don't know. I think it's a mindful way to like just judge your habit. It's like, wait, why am I doing this? What's the purpose? What type of effect am I seeking? Yeah, I don't know. It was like a really insightful piece of advice to hear. And I just thought it was funny over nicotine. Like, somebody has a nicotine dose that they're really aware of. Like, that's really cool.
That's great. That is really good advice. It actually reminds me of something I just heard at one of our storytelling sessions when a guy said, know your number. And he was talking about 5-MeO-DMT, which a lot of people call the God molecule, because it's, DMT is the active ingredient in ayahuasca. And so it's a very beautiful, pretty, overwhelming 2 to 5 minute event. And then, but it can be very external in its way, and a lot about pretty things and alien beings and stuff like that. 5-MeO-DMT is often called the God molecule because it is much more about the reaching oneness with the universe, facing yourself and your family. It can be a much more personal drug experience. And this one speaker said that he'd spent years turning people on to 5-MeO-DMT, and it's a very powerful molecule. And so for him, 12 milligrams was his sweet spot. And he said for every person, he'd have to work with them for a while to figure out what their dosage was. But he had a very innovative smoking system, because it can be a hard drug to ingest by smoking. But he said he'd work with people and he'd find their number and then click. They could get there every time to that oneness experience was what they were looking for. And it was fascinating to hear for that drug, it came down to the milligram of what made sense for you. But it speaks to exactly what you're talking about. How much mushrooms do you want today? Are you microdosing? Are you minor dosing? Are you going to take 30 grams and see angels and demons fight like Kalindi E preaches, which is someone I recommend to anybody who takes little bits of mushrooms. He will push you to where the angels
what was it,
and demons
25
live.
grams he said at a symposia event?
He does
like,
25 grams. He says you have to sneak up on it. Yeah, we have him out whenever we can. He is one of the coolest, most fun speakers that we've found anywhere.
I had him on my Occult Sentinel podcast a while back. It was such a great conversation. I couldn't believe how much fun I had talking to him.
Yeah.
I guess he puts on great events in Detroit too, right?
Yeah, I haven't made it out there yet, but I want an excuse to take a bus out to that city because apparently it's the center of it's the navel of the country at this point. So, but yeah, it does speak really well to knowing thyself and knowing your drug. And this is the oldest idea. Goes back to Paracelsus, that the dosage makes the medicine, and that any drug you have can absolutely be poisonous in its way. And the old idea oftentimes is if you can feel your medicine, then you took too much. And so when people are microdosing psychedelics or things like that, and they're getting a little bit trippy, it's not actually, if that works for you, that's great, but it's not what researchers like Jim Fadiman and the old doctors are talking about. It really is supposed to be a very moderate, minor piece. And we're not exactly sure why that works. It's likely because it's growing new brain cells, literally in the brain, which is a fascinating idea because, it's not more than 10 or 20 years ago that humans learned we do grow new brain cells. It was one of those great scientific truths is that you have the number you have for the rest of your life. Turns out that's not true, especially in the hippocampus where memories are formed. We're making new brain cells. And so, but we still don't know much about the mechanisms of action on that, especially because we're only looking at mice, because you can't cut up humans and look if their brains are growing. Right. Though I think you'd like to do that to college students.
Someday.
Someday. Well, But it appears that the psychedelics, ketamine, and cannabis are all actually causing new brain cell growth, often by the GDNF growth factor. But it turns out that it might not as much. Maybe it isn't the serotonin type stuff as much. Maybe it is an actual new brain cell growth thing. Maybe this is binding other places that we don't really know about. As much as I love the biochemistry and neurochemistry, because that's my background, it can be easy to remember that it's only one little slice of the pie, and that in this slice of the pie, we know about as much about our brains as we do about the bottom of the ocean, which is to say we have a little bit mapped out. And what we do have mapped out is fascinating, and it will take you years to figure out what we know, even the basics of it. But to anyone in the field, all they see is more questions. And it's an exciting time in science to see all of these new technologies coming online that are going to be ramping up all these types of research so much faster and so much better. And not only for the basic science stuff, but for the clinicians, the ability of having smartphones and smart wearables that take all of that data in that currently makes clinical trials so expensive. Right now, it's the monitoring your patients that costs so much money. It's not the drug. So hopefully soon we'll be able to give MDMA to regular people or people suffering from depression and let them monitor themselves a little bit better now that the safety profile is proven. The number of models on how these drugs get out into the world is phenomenal and has really only been broached. MAPS is often pushing the hospice model, which is really I think an ideal way to roll this out, because when MAPS started 30 years ago, hospice was just beginning. And now, 30 years later, hospice is an incredibly important institution for death and dying. And so I think MAPS is hoping to see that same thing evolve with a psychedelic hospice movement, which really, for any of your readers out there, the book to read, I think, is The Island by Aldous Huxley. Of all the reading I've ever done on what a sane, down-to-earth psychedelic society could look like, it's the utopian island that he created in the South Pacific. And I still have yet to see anybody better really craft, in fiction or nonfiction, the ways that we could fit these old drugs into our new society.
Yeah, that's a question I ask myself all the time. The modern research is so fascinating. I think the clinical setting has its use and collecting data and stuff like that. I always go back to some of those indigenous roots. I always ask the question of ceremony and ritual, how important is that? The sacred space that we hold when these substances are administered. Yeah, I always go back and forth. What's the best way to do this? Do we just cut our roots and move on and create something totally new? Or do we listen to the stories of these people that have been using sacred plant medicines for a very long time and might know a map, and they might have but then again, they don't know everything as well. We grow and evolve, and yeah, it's going to be an interesting question to keep asking ourselves as this field continues to grow.
Yeah, it's really true. And the thing about the power of these drugs, and as Stan Grof calls them, unspecific amplifiers of the psyche, they can take you off in any direction. And so it'll be such a diverse ways of right answers. And it's true. There's so much to be learned in the Amazon, and other people groups have been taking these drugs for a long time. But a lot of the healers down there, they're dealing with their people and their environment, and the jungle is a very different place than the jungle of New York. They're both dangerous as hell. It's just dangerous in different ways. And so some of the practitioners do really well transitioning from the Amazon up to here, and their message doesn't resonate quite as much, which is fine. What I really see fascinating around the modern psychedelic movement is how many different practitioners have really spent a number of decades listening to indigenous healers around the world in some kind of form. They found a path that made sense to them. Then they bring it back to the States, and they integrate some of their they're Western concepts. You know, if they want to be Jungian, or they want to follow the precepts of Stan Grof, or if they want to incorporate some more of the modern wisdom, it's going to integrate better into their clientele. You know, especially to such a verbal society like we are, and our stress on words and and the golden age of television. You have to be someone who is flexible as a healer to bring yourself to your audience, to your patients. It's a big concept in neurolinguistic programming, which is, you know, very much something for healers, for therapists. And it says, if you're not getting through to your client, that means you need to be working on more tools to get through with them. It's not their fault if your 3 different plans of attack don't work. That means you have to get more innovative. And that's with the really great people who are holding space for all of these different drugs and all of these different ways, is that they have a very nuanced approach rooted in an apprenticeship model where they first learn things, eventually leading to themselves being comfortable enough to hold space for other people. But the best ones always see themselves as constantly learning. The people that always bear the most watching are the ones who have things figured out. Mm-hmm. Because stagnation is death. And I think you especially see that in the dark underbelly of these practitioners, which there's a lot of press about it, and there deserves to be. There are a number of practitioners, both in the Amazon and as bad or worse up here in the north, of, you know, especially older guys taking advantage of women. It's one of the classic things that happens around power in general. And if these drugs are nothing else, they are incredibly potent tools. And so around potent tools, this kind of racist and sexist action often comes up. I mean, it's actually interesting when you look at the history of magic and grimoires and spells and things like that. The spells that were written down, the vast majority of them were for 2 purposes. They were either to find great treasures or to get laid. That's why people are doing this. You know, there were always great practitioners using alchemy and magic to better themselves. They realized that the trick was actually the gold was inside their skulls. But for so many, it was to further their own ends. And these drugs are no panaceas for human society. As my anarchist friend Dimitri Mogianis also often likes to say, if you are a sociopath who takes acid, then you become a really sharp sociopath. Mm-hmm. And that's what's going to happen. Even I can never remember the name, but he was high up in the Department of Defense under Nixon. And on acid, he came up with the secret bombing pattern for Cambodia that would be the most effective.
Wow.
And that is what these tools can do. The evil is just as strong as the good. And it'll be interesting to see as they inevitably, I hope, start to percolate out to the rest of the world as something normal. It'll foster innovation everywhere. There's a great article in Business Week talking about the reason that Silicon Valley in the United States is such a hotbed of innovation isn't only because of the concentrations of talent, it's also because they have this secret tool that the vast majority is using that isn't getting used around the rest of the world, and that's psychedelic drugs. Most of these people are going to Burning Man or around the Burning Man scene. They're used to drugs fostering innovation. That's one thing that separates Bangalore from Silicon Valley, is that there are more psychedelic drugs going on there, and there's more creativity coming out. And with the number of tech geniuses who came out and said that psychedelics were integral to the kind of outside-the-box thinking it takes to create computers and to create this whole new world, I'm hoping that this will be a really important time for innovation, and that Silicon Valley will lose its lock on this incredible tool, and that this will become a tool used by everybody for their own creativity and self-growth.
Do you ever think that the LSD microdosing stories from Silicon Valley are a little overplayed?
Yeah, probably. Journalists are always looking for a headline. And the insider thing on journalists is apparently if a newspaper headline ends in a question mark, Normally the answer to that question is then no. No, it's not. And and you'll thank me for this later because it's so much fun. Once you realize that, you just look around and you're like, oh God, everyone's just full of shit. And I think the person to look to, like I said earlier, is Jim Fadiman for what microdosing is and how helpful it is. And there have been some really good pieces of journalism coming out about this, but there's also been a lot of overhyped. Oh, this is just working for everybody, and there's no downside, and everyone should be doing it. And that's not true for any drug. The main contraindication for using psychedelics is if you've had a psychotic break from reality in your own past, or you have a very close family member who has had the same. And that's the people who most of all should be careful using psychedelics, especially at high doses and pushing it really hard. But I'm sure with all of the different neurochemistries in this country, there are some people for microdosing the psychedelics is not a good thing and is not going to be helpful for them, just like for some people coffee is not helpful. And so the thing that seems might be true for microdosing is the drug that works for you at high doses is a drug you should try for light doses. Mm-hmm. Personally, acid has never agreed with me. It's never been my drug. It just, for whatever reason, it fills me with energy with nowhere to go, and I just kind of get heebie-jeebie on it. But mushrooms just speak to my soul, and they always have. And they've always been very integral to whatever I am. And so it seems like the drugs that work best there are the ones that are going to resonate best at the lower doses. And that, it's not always true, but it seems to often be true. It also speaks to the point that usually, from what I've gathered of collecting people's drug stories, is that their favorite psychedelic is often their first psychedelic.
Huh.
And I usually ask the questions in that order too, just to test to see. But usually it's that memory of that first time you had a really good psychedelic experience that will color all of the rest. That's actually what Viktor Pelevin said. He's this great Russian drug writer, and he said, your first good experience of drugs and sex will affect all the rest for the rest of your life. And which is, good as it is horrifying, with the amount of abuse that gets heaped upon children in this society. I think even more than we suspect actually happens. That can change everything for the rest of your life. And the links we're starting to learn between early childhood abuse and the possibility of later addiction to alcohol, opiates, behavioral addictions, anything that gets you out of this reality is becoming to seem like one of the strongest links that we know. And it's so incredibly sad to see that generational maltreatment being passed on, but it also speaks to why it's such a vital time to get these psychedelics and MDMA and cannabis out there, is because for whatever reason, they seem to have the ability that instead of sweeping things under the carpet like so many modern therapies, as Leo Zeff said, they take the carpet out back and they beat the hell out of it. Mm-hmm. And these psychedelics give you a chance to go very far back. And for someone with MDMA, you might finally start to realize that person who hurt you, they're no longer here and they can no longer hurt you. And if there's anything that I hope that these drugs can enable, it's to help ease so much of the early suffering that this society is still so poor at preventing happening to children.
Yeah, that hits me because I work with kids in crisis, or that was my job for the past like 2 years or so, and I've seen so much of that. And yesterday, I was at work and we have like a process group, and so all these kids were just talking about their traumas and like using drugs with parents, and like, yeah, it's absurd, and it's so heartbreaking to hear that. And it got me thinking about like some of the intergenerational trauma, how that has played an effect, and it's just this snowball effect that once the one thing that like really stuck out was this one person was saying like, my mom was my best friend. They got me high, like I did drugs with them, and they weren't being a mother. And like, it was just like so interesting. And they were like, the self-awareness of this person of being like, I don't want to live that life anymore, and I realize that my path is going to end up like hers, and I'm taking the time to come to this program so I can try and get better so I don't fall into that. And like that is so courageous to like realize like you're at that point where you go, wow, like yeah, I've been traumatized so much and I'm going to just pull back and deal with myself for a little bit and deal with my own story. But yeah, that hits home because that's been my work for the past like 2 years or so. It's tough.
Whew, wow, good for you. Thank you for your service. It's tough stuff.
I've heard a lot of weird stories.
Oh, man.
Kid was like telling me they're like shooting their mom up because they're like so, their mother was already doped out. I was like, Jesus Christ, no wonder why you're here, like how do you deal with that? You're 15, like go out and play in the woods, and and yeah, it's sad. But I always think like there's a really cool interest in like healing on this intergenerational trauma of like parents and grandparents and stuff like that comes through some of these experiences. I mean, you even see that in like breath work of people saying, oh, I'm reliving like this experience of like my grandfather going through the war, or stuff like that. And then I know for myself, having like those type of experiences of breath work have been really cathartic and really healing, of like just having a sense of compassion of like what maybe my parents went through and being like, oh wait, yeah, they're not bad people, they were just normal people that screwed up. And instead of like holding on to all this anger, I'm like, oh no, like they did the best that they could. And just having that extraordinary experience of maybe having a little bit more empathy for what they went through and just understanding it through a new perspective has really helped me. And I think there's great benefit in these experiences that people have.
Yeah, I think it's true. As my buddy Dimitri says, psychedelics, hopefully you get to be a little bit less of an asshole. That might be all you get, but that's what you want.
Is Dimitri the Iboga guy in New York?
Yes, you got it.
It's a great transition. Let's talk about Iboga.
Cool.
So obviously there's a lot to talk about with Iboga. It's probably like the scariest of the psychedelics for a lot of people. But, it even gets highlighted on, what was it, Showtime's Homeland with Claire Danes. Like they used Iboga to get somebody clean off of heroin. And it's getting a lot of really solid press for heroin therapies, opiate addiction therapies. Like what do you think is super special about that drug in particular?
The thing that I think is most special about that drug, as coming from the biochemistry perspective, is how many things it does. It's really incredible. Most of the drugs we're talking about, recreational and not, are fairly specific. The psychedelics are generally hitting on the serotonin 5-H2A receptor. That's mostly what's happening there. What Ibogaine does is hits on so many different receptors, dopamine and serotonin, and the NMDA receptors related to glutamate, just like ketamine. And so it's what scientists would call a really dirty molecule, or pharmacologists would call a really dirty molecule, because they like small, repeatable things that do just one function, so you can measure what happens downstream. When you're changing a couple of major neurotransmitter systems in significant ways, it's a very hard drug to study. And so Iboga is the root, and then Ibogaine is the actual molecule, but both of them do a lot of different things. And so it seems like if I had to guess, that the glutamate ketamine-like response is what's responsible for stopping the physical withdrawal symptoms. But then the more psychedelic aspect of this old African root hallucinogen herb drug is that the psychedelic part of it really helps you to understand what you've been doing with your life, what pain your use might have caused. You might get a better sense of, now that my body isn't crying out for it, my brain, my mind is giving me the reason not to go back. And I think that's part of the reason that makes it such a helpful therapy is that it's working both sides of the mind-body connection fairly strongly too. There is no panacea, but there's a reason that people very deep in the addiction world preach this drug so highly. They are not trying to fool anybody. They really found something that they have to preach from the rooftops to get any kind of traction on. And that this has been ignored for so long just speaks to the myopia of current research. The anecdotal evidence is overwhelming, and the science is nowhere near catching up. And it's sad because it can be so effective for people, and there's almost no people doing it, even around this country. There is some underground in this Iboga world. Dimitri himself got busted, but so he doesn't do it. And so there's, as far as I know, there's almost no practitioners in the United States doing it. You have to fly to Mexico or to Costa Rica or places like that. And that's not in the reach of many addicts who are living on the street. And it shouldn't have to be. As cheap as this is, it should just be a service offered by the city, like STI clinics are offered by the city. It would take about that much money to do it, and you would save even more on healthcare costs downstream. It actually is a no-brainer in terms of city resources. But, cities don't have a brain. And they don't act like it either.
Practically, how does it look in the session? Do you know, is there a lot of therapist hand-holding required, or are they pretty deep in their business for the time?
I'm sure it really depends on the sitter and how they like to run their sessions. What I've mostly heard is more hands-off and letting the drug do its thing. Oftentimes, people are really overwhelmed. When they call it a flood dose, when you get the full experience, and it is flooding your brain with this drug, and it can be very, very overwhelming for people. I mean, it's a 3-day psychedelic trip, and it's called, if ayahuasca is called the grandmother by these healers, Iboga is called the grandfather. And so you can go to Gabon and get initiated into the Bwiti religion that's been using these, and learn about how they use this drug in ceremony, and which is what many of the practitioners do. But then when they bring it back to the States and they're looking at a more medical model, they definitely want to incorporate that spiritualism as part of it. But really, it's about you having the experience, and the drug will take care of you. The answers that this drug is unleashing are the answers that are already within you. And that's the thing that's often needs to be remembered about these drugs is it's not that little tab of LSD that is doing this. It's just unlocking a key to something inside yourself that Blake was accessing a couple hundred years ago without drugs anyway. Everything is within the human mind. Mm-hmm. These are just different keys to parts of yourself. And so Iboga can be an incredibly personal experience. If you want to read one of the best trip reports, the Tea Fairy, who writes for Erowid, she has a great Iboga trip report. And she talks about how she was getting bored because she thought the drug wasn't coming on and that maybe it doesn't work for her, which is always something to remember out there, folks. Just that moment when you think, wow, this drug's not going to work on me. I must be resistant to this drug. Careful with that thought. That's usually just about when you're going to get your ass handed to you.
Yeah.
And for her, it wasn't quite that bad, but she thought the drug wasn't going to work for her. And so she took out her cell phone and just started scrolling through her cell phone, just trying to waste time. Underneath the blanket, she thought that her sitter couldn't see it. And so she's scrolling through her cell phone, but it turns out that this time her cell phone it has all of her memories on it, and it's holographic, and it's 4-dimensional. And it turns out that she can scroll through every memory that's ever occurred in her life and play it back in real time, full high def. So it's like she's reliving it.
Wow.
And so that was part of her healing process, is the things that she went on to see after that. But turns out she never had her cell phone at all. It was completely within her own head. And that's the power of what this drug can do to you for several days straight.
Wow.
I mean,
yeah,
go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say we had somebody share a story at the Vermont Symposium of Storytelling that went down to Costa Rica, I believe, and he was saying that that retreat center, that healing center, they use ceremony before the session, I believe.
Yeah, I think any good practitioner is setting up some kind of ceremony and some kind of way to hold space. And sometimes they're alchemists and they use the four elements. Sometimes they're Christians and they use the Santo Daime, or sometimes they're Western rational imperialists, but then they use the psychotherapy model to really set up a good space. And that's really what any good healer is doing is, getting the set and setting ready for the participants, not to let them out of the experience or to make it easier, but to allow them to face the difficult things that might come up, and which can be very uncomfortable and very painful, and is one of the reasons these drugs might never integrate fully into this society, because we're very much at a stage where the going thinking is, well, I want to be healthy, but I don't have to do anything for it. And so if it's a matter of a pill or a small lifestyle change, that's fine. But if you want me to exercise to get my heart in better shape, well, that's another thing. If you want I want to stop feeling anxious, but I don't want to confront all the demons of my childhood and young adolescence, well, they're going to be at an impasse. That's, if you want to change, that stuff has to be faced. And a good healer just allows you to face yourself, and they have some helpful tools that might help you navigate. But really, your own life comes back to you. Mm-hmm. And these healers are only assistants, and the good ones are the ones who know it's not them. The shamans to watch out for are the ones who are fool themselves and thinks their own shit doesn't stink. I mean, just like any guru anywhere across the planet, gurudom makes it very easy to not have to look at your own life and as a way of escape. And the really good ones are the really humble ones.
Right. Yeah. In this book, Narrative Medicine, the author Louis Malmadrona, I believe his name is, he was saying that, in that traditional healing, it's like 75% the individual, maybe like 15% like greater spirit, and then like 5% the shaman's doing the work. But most of the work is you, and then whatever maybe like higher force that you believe in, if that's a thing. Yeah, the shaman plays a very small role.
Well, and it's true, but it depends so much on the experience too, how deep you want to go. I mean, I would encourage anybody listening that there's very few people who can't take a very moderate dose of psychedelics by themselves in their bedroom and have some kind of good experience with it. And I think it's in reach for all of you. I know a guy who started a church, and his church is every Sunday morning at 5:00 a.m. He takes his one hit of weed that week. And so that's when he has his own private church service. And so much of what is important is just taking that time for yourself. What I always say to my father is that anyone knows that saying Sunday night is going to be my MDMA date night with my partner is going to be a good thing for your relationship. But that only partially has to do with the drug. So much of it is saying, I'm going to spend time with you, and I'm going to focus on you for this time. I personally believe that the drug really helps in that kind of focus, but if you and your friends go out in the middle of the woods and don't eat mushrooms, you're still out in the middle of the woods together and good stuff will happen. The mushrooms are just a helpful tool for what all of us want to do, grow ourselves and grow with our community. So, take your own drugs, buy the ticket, take the ride. And really, if mushrooms are your thing, there's some great kits online. And Kalindi E talks about this a lot, in the sense that if you buy your own mushroom kit and figure it out, and some of them are so easy that you don't even have to open the outside bag and it just grows themselves, then you can keep using that spore for the rest of your life to keep growing new mushrooms. And then you always have your own supply of psychedelics, and you don't have to depend on any dealers or anyone else who might step on things, and you get to have your own medicine. And to me, it's really heartening that two of the most powerful plant medicines on the planet, cannabis and fungus, magic mushrooms, you can grow yourself, and it doesn't have to be that hard. Actually, and same for opium too, which is the other third of the triumvirate of important plant medicines. And so often, what people who need a little bit of pain relief they don't need oxycodone. They should just take some opium tea. It's at least start with that. To start with a pill when you could start with opium tea is just silly. Opium tea is just obviously easier and better for a lot of people. And if you do get addicted to it, which you can, it's not the same level of addiction as these pills that you can pop without knowing it and are just more horse tranquilizers, more level doses.
So Lex, you mentioned earlier that you're working potentially on a second book. Do you have a first book?
I am in the middle of my first book, but she's a rather large whale of a book, for better or for worse. And so it's the story of the human endocannabinoid system and how we came to discover that all of us actually make our own cannabinoids. Just like the opium plant gave us morphine about 100 years ago, and we used the morphine molecule to really send a hook into our own brains, into our own neural ocean, and pull up these endorphins that we had no idea that we had. Turns out that we have painkillers that are just like the plant. Actually, turns out our brains make morphine itself. We just realized more recently. But the same story happened with the cannabinoids, except it happened about 60 years later, because THC wasn't identified as the active ingredient in marijuana until 1964. Until the 60s really got started, which in scientific terms is very, very recent. And then we started learning so much about these cannabinoids, but it still took until 1992 to discover anandamide, which is my great white whale. It is the first endogenous neurotransmitter that's a cannabinoid that we discovered in our brains. And it attaches to the CB1 receptor, which turns out to be the most abundant G protein coupled receptor in the brain. And that's a really specialized kind of receptor. It's very complicated, and it took about 7 Nobel Prizes to really figure out how those G protein coupled receptors work. But what's important about them is around 40 to 50% of modern medicine focuses on targets on G protein coupled receptors. All of the drugs that you're buying are working on these, many of the drugs. And so it turns out that cannabinoids are the widest range of this incredibly important wide-ranging receptor system. And so much has been written about weed. And I have all the books here behind me. I've read roughly around 75 books on weed at this point. And everybody said some aspect of it better than me before, except for the endocannabinoid system. That's been covered in the popular press and in these other books quite well, but they only go as deep as anandamide and 2-AG, which are the two best characterized endogenous cannabinoids, and then the CB1 receptor that's in the brain, and the CB2 receptors that's on every organ and seems to interact with the immune system somehow. And so that's as deep as most people want to go in their books. And so I'm going to base my book on Moby Dick, because that's the only thing that gives me enough room in its 135 chapters to go into the depths of all of the biochemistry and neurochemistry we learned about this endocannabinoid system. But since people don't care about neurochemistry, I'm actually, instead of the brain, I'm going to make it the ocean. And so neurotransmitters and molecules, it's going to be fish under the sea and all the currents. And so each neuron will be its own city-state with all of these thousands of different players all trying to influence a neuron to either fire its electrical signal or not. And so it's going to take not only fish interacting in a democratic society, because there's so many different types of molecules, the fish were going to have personalities and political affiliations and sexes and all kinds of stuff. And so it is my big whale of a project. And so it's been about 3 to 4 years of research, and it's probably going to take me another 2 to write. But the real heart of the matter of what I'm trying to get out there is that cannabis is an incredible medicine for aging. For all of these different diseases of getting older, this is the reason I'm preaching cannabis to grandmas at the top of my lungs. And it always gets a laugh, but it's actually incredibly, vitally important. Because what cannabinoids can do for neuroprotection against Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, MS, ALS, anything where the brain cells are dying, it's very important. As well as the autoimmune disorders like Crohn's, lupus, arthritis, chronic pain in general. It makes opiates work better. You need less opiate painkillers, and the cannabinoids by themselves already a decent painkiller. And then And the thing that is the best seller for especially elderly women is that all of the cannabinoids grow new grow new bone cells. And so, since all women have osteoporosis during menopause, it's only a matter of degree of bone loss that they have. It's fascinating that because normally people are only looking at THC or CBD. In this one study, they looked at, in addition, CBN, CBG, and some others, and they found that they're all growing new bone cells, and that is one reason that I believe, pretty much everyone over 50 should go online and buy CBD oil from Bluebird Botanicals. I have no stake in the company. I just know they make good quality medicine.
That's my buddy's company out here.
Is it? It's God bless them. I've been preaching them for years because they make good medicine. They'll send it anywhere in the country. And if you want to turn on your grandparents, you can tell them, quite honestly, listen, this is so legal and safe that we're getting it shipped in legally, and it's non-psychoactive. So you can put this in your tea in the morning. You can put it in a tincture and rub it on your skin. You don't have to get high. And it might be rather subtle effects, but the amount of healing and protection it does is incredible, even for healthy people. And what it can do for people who are truly sick is incredible, especially since it has really almost nothing in the way of drug interactions. Most drugs screw up when they interact with something else. CBD especially is so non-interactive, and it seems like the main thing it does is make other drugs work, if it affects them at all. And there's just almost no reason not to do it. The main downside is it can wake you up like a cup of coffee can wake you up. And so this might not be the medicine to take before bed, though it might put you to sleep. The thing about cannabinoids is more than any other drug, almost in the pantheon of drugs, you have to know yourself with cannabis, because all the different cannabinoids will have different effects on you. All the different terpenes that make up the smell will change how the cannabinoids interact with you. And most importantly, you have your own endocannabinoid system. You have CB1 receptors on all of the highest levels of your brain, and the levels in my brain will be different than your brain, which is why you might get sleepy and you might get excited and I might get violent, which is all, people get high on weed in such a variety of ways because you have such a different setup in your brain to respond to it. And it's going to be the same thing with your the rest of the CB receptors we start to discover, because there's so many of them. There will be so many nuanced ways to interact with them, and that's why the rise of synthetic cannabinoids is the last part of my book, where I'm really going to take a lot of shit, because people hate synthetic drugs. All of these hippies who love weed are like, oh, all the synthetic cannabinoids are bad, and it's completely not true. I think often flower cannabis is exactly what people need for their first line medicine, but if you're dealing with somebody who has severe childhood epilepsy, or they have a glioma growing in their brain, a cancer that's going to kill them within a year, smoked marijuana might be too inconsistent in what it does. And maybe if you find the right synthetic cannabinoid very similar to one that's known, it might be much more highly targeted to avoid all of these other off-target effects that you don't want. CBD does about 65 different things at the biochemical level in a cell. That's massive. That's all. I mean, it's a crazy, unheard of drug in that way. But that's not always a good thing. Sometimes, whatever the healing that CBD is doing, you don't want it to do all the other things. You want it to do that one specific action. And that's what modern pharmaceutical science is good at. And that's we need the modern pharmaceutical companies to look at these drugs and get better tools, as much as we need the laws to be written so the medicine grown from flower is as cheaply and as easily accessible to any medical patient in the country as we can possibly make it. And so those are two very, very different goals, but both of them need to be kept in mind as we move forward. And the hard part with cannabis is that it is clear that the negative sides are certainly there, especially for people with schizophrenia in their family. But there are many harms to cannabis. They're moderate, but they're absolutely out there. And all stoners know somebody who shouldn't be smoking so much pot, that people who have something they would call an addiction. People will admit, if you want to see a great example of it, read Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. It starts out with an account of cannabis addiction that seems drawn from life, especially in a book that I think is probably the best fictional treatment of addiction written that I've ever seen. in fact. And he starts off with a cannabis addiction case that I think is quite clear. You can get addicted to shopping and sex and eating to an extent that it completely wrecks everything in your life. You can certainly get addicted to cannabis in that way too, as well as, and on top of, cannabis is moderately physically addictive, and it can be mentally addictive because anything can be mentally addictive. And so the dark side is going to be the dabbing. This is actually where I'm going to piss off the most people, which is why I'm the most excited about it. I consider myself a professional devil's advocate. But like, if people don't know what dabbing is, it's an old method in a lot of ways. It's only really hit in American society in the last 10 or 20 years, but it's hash oil. It's basically very concentrated, be up to 80 or 90% THC. Unfortunately, right now, it's mostly being extracted using butane, which, when done poorly, means there's a bunch of butane gas that you're huffing with your dabs. If it's done very cleanly, it can be done industrially quite well. I mean, using butane to get out the molecules you want is an industrial process that can be done in a very clean, safe, effective manner. Probably as the field moves forward, we'll start doing more CO2 and cold water press type stuff because that's even cleaner. But what it really means is now we have this hash oil that is incredibly potent. And if you are a high school kid who likes to push it with your drug use, like so many of them do, in addition to drinking all of that whiskey and vodka that you're pounding down, now you can start dabbing a couple gram quantities of hash oil at a time. And so that means, in effect, you can do one giant dab and get an entire weekend's worth of THC joints into your system right away. And then you can be sitting there and do 2, 3, 4 more dabs like that, one after the other. And so what the best analogy I've come up with in terms of new drugs, because there's always the new drug, this is very similar to when humans invented spirits and liquors. Before that, there was wine and beer, and you could certainly get drunk, but it would take you some time to get drunk. And you would, in that time, you'd have to stand up. You'd have to take a piss. You'd have to get a decent sense of how drunk you were. Then when liquor came along, it became the soldier's joy, because you could just sit there and go chew, 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 and do 10 shots in a row and be more screwed up than you ever have been in your life, and more than humans had ever been. And that's about to happen with cannabinoids. You could get incredibly high before by eating an edible, but it would take 2 hours. But now it's so easy to get higher than humans ever have consistently. And if there's one thing that's clear from the research, it's that huge amounts of cannabinoids aren't great for developing adolescent brains. It's obviously not going to kill you, but I think the research is clear enough from the longitudinal studies done by scientists and by anyone who's been in the field paying attention to stuff for 20 or 30 years. Kids who smoked a ton of pot, it can, later on down the road, not be good for them in terms of depression, mental health stuff. It turns them into stoners. I mean, it sounds silly to have it's a scientific idea, really. You depress your CB1 receptors eventually. Yes, it can go back. For some people, maybe they can't. And so all those moderate harms that science has found from cannabis in the last 20 or 30 years, which are real, but are obviously pretty moderate for most people, I believe that they're about to get greatly enhanced by that small percentage of the population that is going to push it way too hard with dabs. And there's going to be a very sexy big marijuana business, and that's going to be all of the power of their advertising is going to be doing what big alcohol is doing now, because the money in big liquor is from the small percentage of people who are drinking 10 to 20 shots a day. And that's going to be the same thing in marijuana. All the moderate users, they're not really going to count that much as a sales force, because you're not going to get them to be smoking that much more pot. They're going to keep smoking a joint or two a week, and that's it. It's the people who are doing way too much is where the profit is, and there's going to be a very strong incentive for American marijuana businesses to get their people smoking as much pot as possible. And I believe very strongly that anyone should be allowed to imbibe as much drug as they want. You can't stop anyone from killing themselves with drugs. I think it's the most un-American idea. If you want to be stupid with your drug on yourself and you're not affecting anyone else, you have that right to be as stupid as possible. But health officials and legislators in this country have a responsibility to not make it too easy and too sexy, to protect the consumer from practices that are over the top. And how we write those laws on advertising and on consumption limits and on taxation that are really going to affect consumption levels in this country is really the thorniest part of what this is going to be moving forward. For me, it's all encapsulated by the conundrum of I want it to be legal for anyone to get as much of this in their system as they want, because you can't be sending people to prison. If you leave any laws where people can go to prison for it, it's going to continue to be a racist system, sending people of color and long hairs that they don't want into the system. This cannot be illegal in any way. This is a health concern, not a law and order concern. But speaking of that, I do want it to be as cheap and easy to access for any person over 50 as it can possibly be. And how do you write the laws and tax it? Because for the flip side, where I don't want it to be easy for a teenage kid to go on huge benders for unlimited amounts of time. And I want them to have that right. I don't want it to be encouraged. I want the tax laws written so it's not incredibly cheap for them to do that. I want the public health advertising campaigns to suggest reasonable methods of lowering use. Not that those are the most effective things in the world, but they do work somewhat, and they certainly work better than Dare's lies, which actually get people to do more drugs than less.
Joe, you're out in Colorado. Is there any statistics about teenage use going up now that it's legal out there? That's something, yeah. I mean, I always have conversations with teenagers about that and their big usage of dabbing and stuff like that. And, always trying to preach damaging of the brain at a young age. So I'm glad you brought that up, Lex. I think that's really important, because there is a lot of, it's all over social media about, the medical use and how great it is all of a sudden. But yeah, they're also not really realizing that, it could affect your growing mind at a young age.
There's no real stats that I'm aware of in Colorado. I know that I feel like it's kind of similar to, was it Denmark or Netherlands or something?
Oh,
where, legalization happens and then it just gets less and less cool. I don't really care, whatever. Yeah. I'm going to go ride my bike. Cool that it's legal, but whatever. So I feel like there's that kind of attitude. I bet there's small pockets of high intensity dabbing happening in high school kids, but I don't know. I feel like the weather's too good here.
Yeah.
for people doing it too long.
It is fascinating to watch. I mean, it has grown a subculture they call the Oilers for dab oil, or 710 is their number. So August, would that be July 10th is their magic day, 420 for the people with flowers. I mean, but the thing is, for dabbers, they most often can't get high off smoked flower anymore. It's simply not good enough. It's like if you're drinking a bottle of Jack every day, a beer's not gonna touch you. And so not only that is of concern, though, well within someone's rights, the other concern is the dabber's cough. I think the clearest health risk from dabbing is that most people are using blowtorches to get their dabs up to an incredibly high temperature. And so you all over Colorado and California, among the weed scenes, you hear the dabber's cough. And I've seen people that, after 2-3 years of dabbing, they sound like they have the cough of a 20-year 2-pack-a-day smoker. It very quickly damages the lungs. I'm not sure if that's the dabs or the butane. I actually personally suspect that the damage is really from that hot air burning the alveoli of your lungs. Because, I mean, Tashkin is the best guy to look at for the lung consequences of weed. And the fascinating part is it does increase your risk for bronchitis, which is notable in older people. It doesn't increase your cancer risk. And in fact, the crazy part he found was that if you smoke only pot, you have a slightly lesser chance of lung cancer than people who smoke nothing at all, because cannabis causes cancer cells to kill themselves. It's been proven in a lot of different cancer lines, and it's one of these things that it makes me sound like a long-haired crazy guy to say it, but I'm a scientist. I mean, we have 50 cancer cell lines that cannabinoids have been proven effective in, then a whole mess of anecdotal data that's surprising oncologists across the country. I mean, when you have a working oncologist say, what the hell is happening here? Where'd your tumor go? That's something worth paying attention to. And it takes incredibly high levels of cannabinoids. You should, if you are dealing with cancer, the CBD oil from Bluebird Botanical is helpful, but that's more for symptoms. To really kill cancer cells, it seems like it takes huge levels. I mean, the treatments run to a couple grand because it takes that much plant material to take in the amount of THC and the other cannabinoids that are needed. The woman to look to is Mara Gordon, who runs Aunt Zelda's in California. You can look at her site for someone who really knows how to tailor the terpenes to your specific cancer condition.
What about Rick Simpson? You ever look into his stuff?
Yeah, and that's where a lot of it came from as well, is Rick Simpson's oil. Yeah. It's really going by different names, and people have their different processes for how they make it and the strains they get it from. But really, it's a bombing of your endocannabinoid system with huge levels, which can be uncomfortable in the short term mentally. Like, you are often getting just way too stoned, and you don't want that. It can be not particularly pleasant, but compared to chemotherapy, it is quite pleasant. And what even smoked cannabis can do to alleviate the symptoms of chemotherapy is remarkable. I mean, that's what turned on Lester Grinspoon. He had his kid. His kid had cancer at a young age, and the kid in the supermarket, when he saw his nurse one time, he immediately puked on sight of her. That's the kind of sensitivity he had because of the chemo stuff. I mean, just constantly retching. It's like pulling your insides out. And so finally, they decided to try smoked grass. They didn't tell the doctors. And they go in for the chemo treatment, and the kid orders a sub right afterwards to eat. And the nurse is like, "What are you doing?" And they finally fessed up. They're like, "Well, keep doing it." And so that's the great part about trying. You don't have to. I don't think anybody would recommend not trying to go the chemotherapy route, but they would recommend first break up that cancer with cannabinoids and see how they work. Keep smoking pot during your chemotherapy treatment so it's not quite so brutal in your body, and then do another treatment afterwards to clear up the rest. To be used in conjunction. Cannabis is such a pliable medicine for playing well with other medicines and treatments, and that's part of the power of it. You know, it's probably going to make your acupuncture better, your holotropic breath work better. It can make other medications work better. It's interacting with this homeostasis system that we only recently discovered, but really explains why in my book I have about 100 different diseases.
Hey Lex, hold on.
I have the evidence that's worth mentioning. And when you really think about that number, it's remarkable. What drug kills 100 different diseases? Yeah. For another time up?
No. Well, we should wrap up soon, but you cut out when you said 100 different something for maybe 15 seconds there. Uh-oh.
Okay.
Maybe try it.
Okay. No? Should I yank out this? Or rather
Actually,
this?
how about can you disable your
Can I
video?
take out this?
If you disable your video, that should free up
I'll
some
put this back in.
bandwidth.
Should we all disable video?
Yeah, it's not a bad idea.
Cool.
There. Yeah. All right, cool.
Yeah, so
Sweet.
you said 100 different somethings.
Mm-hmm. The remarkable part about cannabis is how many different diseases we've found it worked on. And the evidence ranges all the way from the stuff being done in cells to preclinical work in mice, and a lot of it. It took me years just to figure out the basics of the thousands and thousands of cannabinoid studies that have been done on animal models. But then we've had 10 to 20,000 Americans go through clinical trials in this country and found help for things like nausea and other conditions, MS. And so I, in my book, am going to mention about 100 different diseases that I feel like cannabis has enough proven efficacy that I should mention it. And when you stop to think about that number, it's really remarkable. What other drug do we have that seems effective against 100 different diseases? And there's almost nothing like it. Some of the immunosuppressants can be like that, but they're very new and they're very hard on the body. And they are working on the immune system, and the cannabis is intimately tied up with their immune system. Something about those CB2 receptors helps tie our immune system across our entire body. And we're still teasing out exactly what that means, but it really gives a good scientific backing to how this drug could be effective across so many different diseases of so many different types. And so it's part of the reason this book is taking so long is that it wasn't that hard to find the scientific data in the peer-reviewed literature. I just have to combine that with anecdotal data from all the grandmothers across the country. And that combination is where the power is that if I have a bunch of mouse models that show that Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, where the body's attacking the brain cells and destroying them until you die of suffocation when your lungs shut down. If I have a bunch of mice that show that cannabinoids are helpful for that might be convincing to a few people, but it's still just scientific data, and people have a knee-jerk reaction against it as much as they say they don't. But when you get the story of Kathy Jordan in Florida, who got her diagnosis over 20 years ago and has managed to live this long with a very functioning life, that anecdote is what sells hearts and minds. So for all of these different diseases I'm going to mention, I'm going to have some elderly patient from across the country who I found who is on YouTube who pretty much says, listen, Sonny, I didn't give a shit about cannabis before this. It was just the only drug that worked after me and my doctor tried everything else. And that's the golden moment. That's the thing that I hope will start changing hearts and minds, is the stories of these medical patients getting out there. And to anyone out there listening, talk to your grandparents about cannabis. Whatever, or your aunts, your parents, ask them how's their health, because that's the best way to get them talking about what's going on right now. And I'd be surprised they didn't mention something where CBD oil from Blue River Botanical, or a topical salve, or a tincture made by a good manufacturer, or a vape pen is one of the best ways to get people into cannabis medicine, because if they're having flare-ups of pain or anxiety or things like that, a vape pen is a really great way to get a small shot of cannabinoids into your system as a way of healing. I often stress to people, if your parents are very scared of weed, start with a topical they put on their skin. When that starts working, maybe they'll try a tincture, which is good for chronic administration and for helping protect your body for a couple hours. And then for your acute flare-ups of whatever, you have a vape pen that you can just slightly puff on whenever you need it to balance out your health. And so it is just a remarkably effective medicine for aging, and it's worth talking about to anyone you know. And if you have any questions about it, or want the data, or want advice about it, feel free to shoot me an email. Like I said earlier, pelger@gmail.com. I just want this stuff out there. It is going to be one of the most important fields of medicine moving forward, if we move forward in a relatively sane manner, which is always up for grabs, especially around medical and science research. But if we are acting rationally, we'll see a great deal of cannabis medicines and knowledge hitting over the next decades.
That's really wonderful, Lex. I'm so excited to see this book when it comes out. Do you have a timeline of maybe when that would be done?
I'm just getting my sample chapters done now to start shopping around the publishers.
Cool.
But I'm always, if this intrigues you, or if you like Moby Dick, I'm always looking for artists who want to help contribute. It's very much a pastiche collage kind of book. I'm doing the writing, but then I have a lot of different friends and illustrators, and then classic illustrators from the last couple hundred years that I'm putting all together to help tell the story, as well as interviews and photos from patients. So you can actually see the grandma turn to the camera, because it's a graphic novel, so it is... you can do a lot of storytelling that way. And so if this appeals to you, feel free to reach out. If you're a good Photoshop hacker, I certainly need help there. But any artist, I'd love to put your work into the book, and I can give a tribute to where it came from. If you're an artist that's into whales or weed or neurochemistry, I'd love to work with you. Feel free to reach out to me. The nice part is, though, I don't actually need a publisher, because really I'm treating this like my DIY thesis project. And so it gives me a chance to read a whole bunch of neurochemistry and Shakespeare and the history of science and the history of drugs, and kind of synthesize it all together. So really all I need to do is get this written so I know what's in it, and I prove I can write a book. And the nice part about a thesis project is If only about 10 people read your thesis project, that's great. That's all you're going to get. And so that's fine with me. I'm trying not to hold on to any grand illusions of this thing really taking off, because when you're doing a 700-page pot book about neurochemistry that's 135 chapters based on Moby Dick, you know that there's a really good chance that you kick that whale off the side of the boat and it just disappears down the ocean, never to be seen again. So if that happens, that's fine. I've enjoyed writing it, and I've enjoyed researching it. Now I'm going to enjoy writing it, and I hope to have it done in maybe 2 years. So
Awesome.
Don't hold your breath, but hopefully she will be done and pulled to the surface.
And if anything, it'll just be a great resource for people to look at.
I hope so. I really I want it to be very practical, that it will get people talking to the elderly about cannabis medicine and more nuanced laws.
Awesome. That's really exciting. Yeah, I guess we're probably starting to wrap up soon. We're at about like an hour and a half or so. You have like a wealth of knowledge in this field of drugs and whatnot. And I know last time we chatted, you said that you're also in the process of creating a nonprofit for education.
That's true. I'm just starting down that road, but spinning out from Symposia to start a nonprofit really dedicated to creating community and drug education. To me, that means a lot of storytelling events. It also means more going to festivals and having stages there for them to bring up some experts who can talk about drugs, talk about harm reduction, talk about different ways to use drugs, but also to have an open mic so people can come up and share their own drug stories. Because for people going to festivals, I think that's who they're going to learn from the most, is their peers. Everyone's a little bit distrustful of the expert, no matter how much they might like them. But when it's just someone getting up, maybe high on acid, preaching the truth about the goods and the bads of psychedelics, you're really going to believe them. And so if you are involved in any festival, Symposia is happy to show up in any way we can. If it's as easy as a storytelling and an open mic, we'll do that. If you want a whole drug education stage or a place to create community around this stuff, it's something we like to refer to as harm prevention. Before people start taking some really bad mixes of methoxyethamine with way too much ketamine thrown in with some smoked DMT and some acid, maybe you can learn a little bit more about what works well together and what might not. And so we're always looking to create community and events anywhere. SSDP chapters, colleges, we have most of our people on the East Coast. We'd like to reach out farther west. And we're always happy to come and help create community events in any way we can. So especially if you want to do a storytelling, get in contact with me and we'll try to make something happen.
Awesome. That's really exciting.
Great project.
It should be fun. I'm looking forward to it. I'm trying to just come up with a name now, which is always the hardest part. But at this point, I'm thinking I might call it Mercury Drug Education. Mercury has so many great connotations. It was a medicine. It's still kind of a medicine. He's a messenger of the gods, but, not the most trustworthy fellow in the world. And
the ruler of communication.
Yeah. And he's really, Mercury is very much a modern day god. Since this is the age of networks and communication, that's very much what he was seen as, the old technosis crowd. So that's the plan, just to get more word out and get more people together.
Do you have a personal website, Lex?
Yes, lexpelger.com has some writing on it and some stories of my old days on the road too, and some of my original science research, which doesn't really relate to this. It's very basic biochemistry. not that much of an interest to anybody besides a couple in the field, which is why now I'm in the more educational role.
Cool. Any last shout outs or anything you want to throw in?
Talk to your grandparents about cannabis. Consider taking a psychedelic yourself. Buy the ticket, take the ride. There's no reason not to.
All right, Lex Pelger, I appreciate it. We'll talk to you again soon, I hope.
Thank you both so much.
Yeah, thank you.